This show is strictly for educational purposes. The opinions expressed on the show are personal to the individuals appearing in the show and not those of Thinking Tree Ecoholics Private Limited. The show is not intended to offend or defame any individual, entity, caste, community, race, or religion, or to denigrate any institution, person, living or dead. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
Hello and welcome to Ecoholics Thinking Tree series. Today we have with us very important guest to discuss about the Indian economic aspect addressing the core issues. So we welcome today our guest Dr. Dhiraj Nayyar. He is the current chief economist at Vedanta and former OSD, that is officer on special duty at Niti Aayog related to macroeconomics and trade. He is a prolific writer and a very well-renowned columnist at The Hindu, Indian Express, Economic Times, and Business Standard, and various other newspapers, leading newspaper of our country. So, welcome, sir. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
A lot has already been said about the coronavirus, the COVID, and it has succeeded in masking the underlying bigger problems that our economy has been struggling with for a long time. But let's start with the bigger question first. In your article about the age of anti-globalization, you have said that one of the plus point of global financial crisis of 2008 was the collective action shown by the world, because the countries had realized that it was eventually going to affect them. And however, in the face of more severe problem like COVID, there is no collective action even after 6 months being buried under it. What does a collective action looks like to you?
Yeah, in fact, I think it's one of the great shortcomings of the reaction that the world has had to this pandemic. Because I remember in 2008 when the global financial crisis struck, which was also a global crisis, and after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, it quickly spiraled onto the impact spiraled onto developed countries, developing countries, everyone. And at that time, I remember the global leaders got together, and G20, which at that time was a forum more for finance ministers and ministers to interact, was upgraded to a head of government, head of state level. So, the leaders of the major 20 economies, which were basically 80% of GDP or something, they all got together and coordinated their actions in terms of fiscal policy, monetary policy. And, because when there's a global crisis and it's spilling across borders, sometimes solutions which are only within your border or, within your country don't adequately address it. Similarly, coronavirus in many ways is a twin crisis because it's a global health crisis and a global economic crisis. So in that sense, and both are spilling across borders, right? And starting with the virus, of course, but of course, the economic impact as well. But this time, I think the mood is very different. So if you look at the global leaders now, whether it's in the US, President Donald Trump, UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the general mood of the world now as compared to 10 or 12 years ago is very different. They're much more nationalist leaders, leaders who are looking much more inside their own countries and not, it's a kind of, we are being led by the anti-globalization leaders, so maybe that's one of the reasons why there has not been collective action of the kind there was in 2008 when a different kind of consensus was there globally. But I think even now it's not too late. So when you're talking about fighting coronavirus, developing vaccine, developing health strategies, I think it would be very helpful. Of course, everyone is working very hard and there are many collaborations happening. But if there was international collaboration at this point in terms of developing a vaccine, for example, or other treatments or other testing, I think collective action would you just pool more resources and can get solutions at scale rather than everyone trying their own thing. Of course, earlier on, for example, if we had coordination when it actually broke out, when you're talking about 2-3 months ago, then, a coordinated closing down of borders, a coordinated approach to travel, all these things would have helped if it was done at an earlier stage, but that was not done. And of course, the crisis has spread. But even now, I think there is room for collective action. The WHO, for various reasons, doesn't have the credibility, and the US has withdrawn from it. So even that, which is actually the international organization meant for health challenges, for the health challenge, the economic challenge is of course separate at this point. But even that health challenge is not being dealt with in a collective way. And I think there is room for more cooperation because ultimately we are all in this together, and we'll all have to get out of this together. So if we do our own thing, it will take us longer. If we were to coordinate, it will be faster, and it will address both aspects, the health aspect as well as the economic aspect. So I think we definitely need it, but at the moment, I don't see the G20 hasn't come into this. American President Donald Trump is trying to do a G7 plus Australia, India, a few other countries. So let's see. I'm hopeful that some form of action should emerge sooner rather than later to address this issue.
Yes. And indeed, because like it's humanity against a virus, not humanity is competing with like among themselves.
The virus is not discriminating whether we are American or Indian or British or Japanese, right? It's affecting us all, and it's crossing our borders, state borders, national borders, everything. So I think there's just nothing we can do to say that we can isolate ourselves. Any country can isolate itself from this. It can't.
So how do you say like G7 plus India, Australia, like the Russia also they are trying to include? So how do you see that?
Always, I mean, I don't see what's wrong with G20. That was a good forum at representative with a number of special invitees were there in G20 also. So I think G20 or G7 plus 4 or some forum definitely needed to act both on the health front, which is of course a priority to curb down this virus, to clamp down on it, to make sure that it disappears one way or the other, whether it's from vaccine or treatments. And even when a vaccine is developed, if and when it's developed or a treatment protocol is developed, it'll still need to be reached out to every corner of the world. Not everyone will be able to afford it. Not everyone will be able to supply it. So India, for example, is a very big manufacturer of vaccine and other medicines. So India could play a role in supplying it to many other countries, including the developed countries. So I think all of this, if it's coordinated, will lead to a better outcome, and we'll end this crisis sooner and with less damage than we will otherwise.
Yes, because it will take time to like smoothen the supply chain of all the vaccines.
Absolutely.
Yes. Recently the European Union and recently announced 750 billion economy rescue plan. The European Commission would borrow the funds from the market, and then they will disburse the 2/3 of the grants and rest 1/3 in the loans to cushion the unprecedented slump expected this year due to coronavirus lockdowns all over the place. In addition to this, the Commission also proposes to amend the current multi-annual financial framework of 2014 to 2020 to make an additional 11 billion approximately euro in funding already available in 2020. What lessons can we implement from this move to boost the recovery of our country?
So I think the first thing we need to realize is that this is an extraordinary crisis. Yes. I think even when we talk about 2008, which we just spoke about, or if you talk about India's 1991 crisis, or you talk about earlier periodic economic crisis, this is very different because very rarely has economy of India or the global economy gone into a lockdown for such an extended period of time, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and complete stop of all economic activity except some bare essentials. This is really, really an extraordinary situation, and I think therefore needs extraordinary action. So I think whatever was done in 2008 was very good and it helped us get back on our feet, but this time you need even more. So I think the lessons we learned from the US and Europe, and US and Europe, of course, are much more advanced countries, higher income countries. So maybe in terms of quantum, they can do much more than we can. But I think still, for India as well, this is not the time to look at fiscal deficit. Historically, we have not been very responsible with the with our fiscal policy, which is a fact. In fact, in good times, you should be running a fiscal surplus so that in bad times you can run a deficit. I mean, that's what theory would tell you. But in India, we always run a deficit. Good or bad times doesn't matter. But this is an extraordinary time. So I think at this point, we need to really open the purse strings. We need to do two things. One is to get cash to the poorest sections of society so that they can spend it. They're the ones who will spend it. And second, we need public investment from the government, because I think private investment right now is not going to be forthcoming. So you need government to invest in big projects, say in housing or health. These are the two things which have already shown up as being weak in our country. Our health system needs a big upgrade. Our housing, you can see that the migrant labor problem, that they didn't have enough housing. So these are two sectors in particular where I think you can ramp up public investment, and that will again get growth going, and that will attract private investment. So I think forget about the fiscal deficit for now. Whatever the government has to borrow, it has to borrow. But I think if it borrows too much, it'll push up interest rates and crowd out the private sector from resources. So in this extraordinary situation, I don't recommend this normally, but in this extraordinary situation, the RBI has to monetize a part of the government's debt. In other words, it has to print money. In normal circumstances, and this is something which was abandoned by India because it used to lead to inflation. We used to do it all the time, till the 80s and so on. But in this time, I think there's no fear of inflation. In fact, the opposite is going to happen. There's going to be deflation. So there is a worry that, once you get into a bad habit in India or in any other country, it's very difficult to get out of it. So I understand that concern. But even then, I think at this point of time, we need to take this drastic step because the situation is very drastic. And then we must roll it back in a year or two, or whenever the recovery starts to take place, you shouldn't forget it. We shouldn't keep printing money or keep monetizing the deficit. But for now, I think the lesson we have to learn from the 2008 crisis, from this crisis, from the Great Depression, from every such shock, is that the government needs to step in with big stimulus. And I think so far we've done some amount, but we need to do more.
Yes. Indeed, because NK Singh committee also gave the review of FRBM Act, and they have given the escape clause into that, so that government is legally can do that, can increase the fiscal deficit. So a small question related to the previous question, like how do you see the collaboration of state and the central government? Like central government being a part of Niti Aayog, you must have seen centers preparing the plan, they are making policies, but it depends on the states, like how to implement. So how do you see the coordination must be there?
Yeah. So I think this is a very important point you've raised, and I think in some of the responses to the crisis situation, the health aspect, we've already seen coordination sometimes not happening. I think part of the problem was that in the old pre-2014 days, a lot of coordination used to happen at the Planning Commission level and National Development Council level. Now those have been removed and we've moved to a different era, which is fine. I think the spirit of doing that is absolutely correct, because the center should not dictate to states, which is what the Planning Commission used to do, how to spend its resources and so on. So I think it's very good that we moved to a new system, but I think the coordination mechanism, because in times of crisis or in times of extraordinary circumstances, we need a coordination mechanism, somewhere where everyone can sit and talk. And I think that is what maybe Niti Aayog should be used a little more for at this point of time. But I think you're absolutely right. Again, the cutting edge of government is states, in fact, not even states, districts and local bodies, and the money really needs to go there. I think what is happening right now is that we're talking about the center and the stress of finances at the center, but the states are equally stressed. So the government has done, it has liberalized in its recent measures borrowing limits for the states. So they are normally allowed to borrow up to 3% of their GSDP. It's been raised to 5%, but unfortunately or fortunately, it's been done with conditions. You can raise it to 3.5 without conditions, but after that, to raise it further, you have to meet certain conditions on, one nation, one ration card, implementing, to ease of doing business and 2 or 3 other things, DISCOM reform. So I think all of those are good things. I think those reforms are very necessary for the states. So I hope they will use it as an opportunity. Some people may argue that they should, in this kind of crisis, you should not put any conditions. After all, the center is not putting conditions on itself. But I think on the whole, if the states use this liberalization of borrowing limit, and they can also do reforms in the process, then I think it will be a great thing, because some of the things like states distribution companies, electricity distribution companies are a big burden on the state exchequer because they run losses and they've been doing so for years. So if there's a cleanup at this point and this conditionality can help, I think it's a good thing. But I think on the whole, states' finances also need to be addressed in a crisis like this.
Yes, because we need to keep a check on obviously the state finances. So that's
why
they
can't let it go out of control also. But at the same time, you need to give them the flexibility to also deal with some of the problems that are coming up. But I think it would be nice if the Niti Governing Council, Niti Aayog Governing Council, or some other body was used as a place to have a proper institutional dialogue. So right now, the Prime Minister has met the Chief Ministers a few times over video conference. But those are meetings which happen at PM and CM level. But at institutional level, the advantage is that, other people below PM and CM can also have an institutional way of working with each other. I think that's very important.
Yes. It's like a bottom-up approach, that the main ideology of Niti Aayog. Yes. Dwelling in the past, we have seen League of Nations that came into existence post-World War I. United Nations came after World War II. The situation we are in today is no less than a world war, because world is fighting against a war against some invisible thing that we can say that the world is fighting. Do you feel this calls for the establishment of an intergovernmental body to mitigate such situations? Like, what would be the powers of that body according to you? What would be the primary functions, the roles, responsibilities?
So I think the one thing which was apparent even in 2008 crisis, but is now very obvious, is that the current international architecture we have is not working anymore. So whether it's the UN or its agencies, we spoke about WHO a little earlier, World Bank, IMF, all of these have become less relevant. They were created for an world after World War II, as you quite correctly said, and that's about 70 years ago, 75 years ago. So I think the time for change is now. So I would suggest this is a good moment, and a lot of, as I said, some of the anti-globalization people don't trust these institutions. That could be an opportunity to reinvent them, because a lot of them have become very large bureaucracies. And my view of bureaucracies is that once institutions become very large and bureaucratic, they tend to lose their effectiveness. And I think what you need is effective institutions which can, help countries when they most need it. So I think this is an absolutely right time to rethink the architecture. The older architecture, of course, as you know, one of the obvious problems is that it's biased towards the rich countries and, the permanent members of the Security Council or in IMF, World Bank, the rich countries have bigger shares. So I think you need to democratize it. Emerging economies need a much greater say in institutions. That said, we should not try and go towards something like a world government, because I don't think any country would be willing to cede all its sovereign powers or even a substantial part of its sovereign powers to some intergovernmental body. That won't work. But what you need is institutions which can provide the intellectual heft and the financial backing, and maybe again, as I spoke about Niti, a forum where people can come together and have a proper discussion and dialogue, structured discussion and dialogue. So I would say it's a good chance we should rethink the UN, IMF, World Bank, and think about new institutions, whether they need such large permanent bureaucracies or whether some other model is better. But what we need to make sure is that they are effective when they are needed most. Now what we are finding out is that they are not effective when they are needed most.
Obviously, it's about implementation and the outcome. Seriously, it's not about the
institution. You can have the bodies if they're not serving you with outcomes, then what is the point of having them?
What's the point of? Yes. Moving towards the Indian economy now, we can say with various companies moving out of China, some would say that India stands a chance at becoming the next mass manufacturing hub, given the excess labor that we have, as talked about the economic survey and the global value chains as well. Your article I was reading in one of the newspaper, the Big Bang Reforms to Rescue Indian Economy, that argues only a low corporate income tax that government announced last year is not only the lucrative enough to attract the investors. Cheap land, labor, capital also needed made available. Most recently, we have seen Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, and some other states suspended labor laws to incentivize economic activity and offer a flexible hire and fire regime to restart the operations. The International Labour Organization, ILO, had to intervene and ask Prime Minister to uphold the labor laws. This presents a dilemma between trying to attract investment and making sure that laborers are not exploited. What is your take on that?
So I think the opportunity for India is there in terms of attracting investment from China. But let me also tell you, and you would know this very well, that it's not that investors went to China before COVID or over the last 30 years because they love China or they love Chinese people. They go there because that's the most competitive place to do business. I mean, in terms of labor or land or electricity tariff or logistics cost, it's the most competitive. Therefore, they go there. It is true. Some firms have been exiting China now for 4 or 5 years. Most of them have gone to Vietnam, Bangladesh, not come to India. So they have alternatives. Let's also recognize that. And India is not the only place. We have a large market, sure, but companies who are in China, or who were in China are not making only for China. They make in China for the world, right? Yes. So if they want to come to India, they'll come to India, but want to make in India for the world, which the Prime Minister has actually said is his goal. But for that, again, tax rate, yes, we've got that right. That's one very important thing we've got right. We're improving our ease of doing business. So I give the government full credit for taking those steps. On land and labor, these are the two major next steps which need to be taken. I'm not totally convinced about suspending labor laws because, at the end of the day, you can't have no law. You have to have some labor law. But I think instead of backdoor and trying to suspend labor laws, we should be upfront that labor laws need to be changed in the interest of labor. Forget investors, forget in business, forget rating agencies. It's in the interest of 90% of our workforce, which is in informal sector, for easing of labor laws so that the labor-intensive factories which are currently in China move to India. So you give them land, you give them flexible labor laws, you give them cheap power, they will come. It's as simple as that. And India is, of course, a great market in itself. So I think if you do those 2-3 extra things, you've already done 1 or 2 things, you do 2 or 3 more things in the next 3 or 4 months, and then you will attract that investment in big numbers. Otherwise, you'll get some small investment here and there. You'll have cases of people coming to India, but not that mass migration we want. We want all of those companies, or at least 70% of those companies, to come here and give jobs to Indians. That's the key. At the end, we need jobs, we need those exports. So I would urge the government, therefore, to go ahead. Now that it's done tax, it's done ease of doing business, do land and labor as well, and you will certainly start seeing that investment coming.
Yes, because in China, the big companies already invested billions and they are not new. They have been operating since last 30 years. So it's not easy for India to attract the
Yeah.
investment, especially, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so they're not going to leave. As you very correctly said, they've already invested large money. So it's not that they're going to leave. They'll only leave if there's another destination is absolutely attractive to them, right? It's not, they're not going to move to a more costly destination
Yes.
than where they already are.
That too with the predictable policy making in
Exactly.
future as well. Yes, that is what important. Prior, that is animal spirit, what we call.
Yeah, in
Yes.
fact, in tax reform, I always say that it's very good we've lowered the tax rate to what we have. For new companies, it's 15% now. But the temptation in India always is that some government, maybe not this government, another future government will try and tinker with that, increase rate, impose a cess, impose a surcharge. Those are all things which are not done. Investors don't like uncertainty at all.
Yes, that indeed. Yeah, because as you said, Vietnam and Bangladesh are the other two options. Vietnam is having more or less the same culture, people, or more or less the affection that they got in China, Vietnam. So how India can compete with Bangladesh and China? Bangladesh and Vietnam.
Yeah, so I mean, the additional advantage a country like Bangladesh has is that it's a least developed country, so it also gets export preferences in US and EU and big markets. So textiles, for example, get a big concession by going there. So we have to be even more competitive than Vietnam. Similarly, gives access to East Asian markets around the ASEAN region and so on. So I think we have to, in many ways, become even more competitive in our policies because these countries have certain other advantages which we will not have. I mean, we will not be a least developed country. We will not get those concessions. We will not be East Asia, but we do offer a large market and if we make our policies competitive, I don't see why. We also have a reasonably skilled labor force, English language, labor which works hard. So I think we have the basic conditions, but we just need to improve a few things.
Yes, indeed. If we think about the policy making at the central level, so policy making has also played an important role, as you have said that there must be some prediction, not just for the current government, for the next 1 or 2 governments. So investment always takes 5 to 10 years down the line. So what do you think, in recently, it's my personal opinion that government has been applying supply side reforms, although we need demand side reforms. So what is your take on that?
No, so I think in India, it's always good to have reform on every side, supply side or demand side, because it's so starved of reform that, I won't say don't do supply side, do only demand side. But true, it's a crisis situation. So, I mean, economic theory tells us that, demand needs a boost because otherwise, nobody's going to buy the supply, even if you reform the supply side. So I think in that sense, demand side is important, but I won't negate the importance of any interventions that are made on the supply side as well. The good thing in terms of certainty is that, very broadly, if you look at the years since 1991, now it's almost 30 years since the first serious liberalization began. There have been a few steps backwards. There was a retrospective tax, for example, on that Vodafone case you would remember famously. And there have been this government has, for example, raised some tariffs. There have been some small reversals here and there. Some governments come and put a price control on something. But by and large, I would not say that any government has reversed the spirit of opening up yet.
Yes.
So I think that is a good thing. But I think you need even more certainty. So now you need the certainty that whatever reform, supply side you're doing now or tax reform you're doing now will stay for the next 10, 15 years. Because that's the horizon investors look at. They are not looking at 1 year or 2 years, right? So if they're committing money and they're putting up a factory, then they're looking at stability for a length of time.
I was reading an article in the Economic Times which stated that India's current account could show a surplus this year for the first time in several years. One of the main reasons for that being the decline in the imports, not the increase in the exports. The current account deficit has CAD, that is traditionally been regarded as the weakness, but experts see a bigger problem in a surplus for developing economies like India. What are your views regarding this? Do you think it is viable for a developing country like India to run a current account surplus?
I think it's viable if we get our exports in order, but otherwise, I've noted this also in a couple of articles I've written that in India, sometimes when the current account deficit goes up and we get worried about it, it's often a sign of strength of domestic demand. So when domestic demand is strong, as CAD goes up, of course, it's large part is also governed by commodity prices because we import a large amount of oil and gold and so on. So these are very big things on the import bill. So I think I would definitely say that we can change the deficit situation structurally, but we have to focus more on exports. I think in India, when we talk about trade, even if you talk about trade now or you talk about it 50, 60 years ago, we always look at imports, that we don't like imports. That's our primary narrative on trade. Instead of saying we don't like imports, I think if we go the other way and say that we will export, then the thing is net exports. In economics, what matters is net exports, not whether imports or exports by themselves. And I think some of the things we import, like oil and gold and so on, I think if we liberalize policies, which they're trying to do now, the government, if we can explore more in India and produce more of these critical things in India, then we'll automatically reduce the pressure on the import bill. So I think a lot of China runs such a huge surplus. Germany runs surplus, but generally countries run surpluses when they have huge manufacturing bases and export a lot of manufactured goods. And India doesn't have a huge manufacturing base at all. I mean, it's relatively small. We are good in engineering goods and auto, but not across the board. Similarly, even in services, we consider ourselves a strong services economy, but really the standout there is IT. IT exports are most of it. Where China actually has a bigger share of global services exports than India does. India has about 2.5, China has 3.5, or India has 3 and China has 4, something like that. But I think there again, if we strengthen tourism, education, health, medical tourism, there are sectors where we can look at to strengthen our export side. So I think we can definitely move to a surplus situation, but for that again, we need to address fundamental structural issues. It's not something we can manage or try to manage in the short term.
Moving towards like poverty, what economists and politicians define as poverty in India as basically income poverty. But most of India's poor reside in ecologically rich areas, draw a significant portion of their income from these natural resources. So ecologically degradation has an impact on the level of income also. This is why the number of poor suddenly shoots up after a natural disaster like earthquake, flood, etc. A universal basic income sounds like a probable solution to address this poverty. However, you have mentioned that India currently, with already its strained fiscal deficit and less room to increase that, not in a condition to provide a universal basic income. What else can the problem, like how else can the problem of poverty can be addressed in India? What are the other options?
No, so let me clarify that I did say that, but I would be all in favor of a cash transfer scheme. I'm not a big fan of universal basic income, but maybe a cash transfer scheme which targets 50%. Universal basic income by definition means that you and I and top industry people, everybody gets the same amount of money. So I would go for a more targeted approach, 50% of the population. But where I'm more worried is that in India, all these things come as an add-on. So I would be happy with a universal basic income or a targeted basic income for 50% of people if all the other schemes are removed. The problem is if you have PDS, you have Manrega, you have fertilizer subsidy, you have some other fuel subsidy, you have various schemes running, apparently anti-poverty schemes and so on. But either you just rationalize those and move to an income transfer scheme, give everybody or 50% universal or partly universal, whatever the design. Either you move to a cash. I would be happier with that system, frankly, because this is a very complicated and inefficient welfare system we run with multiple schemes, center, state, so many people are involved. So it would be much cleaner. But the only thing I worry about is that in India, it will never be done as a replacement. It will be done as an add-on. So it will be an additional burden on the fiscal deficit, which I'm not in favor of. But otherwise, I think it's a good idea. But aside from basic income, I think the only way out of poverty, and this is what we should learn really from the station example, is to invest heavily in education and health. And I think this crisis has shown up the challenges we have in our health system. But even if you look at the learning outcomes of our school children, we're not producing the kind of skilled people that are needed for this globalized competitive world. So I think ultimately, if you don't give people the basic capabilities, it's going to be very hard for them to become prosperous. They may eventually get out of poverty by earning a daily wage or doing some basic work. But I think ultimately this country is going to move from something beyond moving out of poverty. I think we've already got a lot of people out of absolute poverty, but relative poverty still remains. And a lot of people still don't have good jobs, decent jobs, social security. So all those things need to come up. But I think education and health are absolutely fundamental investments apart from a cash transfer if it can replace the other subsidies.
Yes. I too agree with you totally, because cash transfer makes a very efficient process. It's like less leakages. But still, there's one question about the exclusion and inclusion error. So how would you set a target? Like what would be that 50%? What are the criterias? How government can set the target?
Yeah. So in many ways, it might even be better to, therefore universal is cleaner because there's no sense of targeting, and those uh, who don't need it don't take it. So it's like a bit of the give it up kind of thing that was done for the gas subsidy.
Yes.
So maybe something like that can be done. So you do it universal, but you appeal to the top 20-30% that they should not avail of that, not take it. But again, as I said, it will be affordable only if we remove the rest. Otherwise, of course, there are other criteria which can be used. Those who have Jan Dhan accounts, which are only, or those who buy the insurance schemes meant for the poor. So there are ways you can target even the 50% or 60%. There are ways you can do that also. And I think with Aadhaar and Jan Dhan and so on, we have the mechanisms to do that more efficiently than we had in the past.
Yes. Obviously, Jam Trinity is one of the biggest reform that we have. A majority of the bigger problems with Indian economy, like unemployment, fiscal deficit, lack of private investment, can be traced back to the series of bad decisions that were taken decade ago. Also, we can say there is a general tendency to ignore a problem until we are neck deep in it, like you can see in coronavirus case as well. To address this, India has an abundance of innovative and qualified people who rather choose to work multinationals in other country because India is no longer an attractive place to live and work for those with for those with opportunities abroad. How do we ensure that the talent produced in India is later infused in our system in India itself?
So I'll tell you from my personal example. I also studied abroad for many years and had the options and job offers to work outside India as well. And this was in that 2006-7 period. And I'll tell you that was 2003 to 8, before the financial crisis, was the period India was growing at about 10%, the highest growth we've ever had. And that attracted a lot of people back, not only me, but a lot of people, a lot of talent came back, because nothing attracts you more than a place which is growing fast, a country that is growing fast. And at that point, it looked like, India is growing at 9-10%, whereas UK and US, are like 2%, 1%, 2%. Sure, you can have a comfortable life there. I mean, I'm not denying that. But the challenge and opportunity you have in a 10% fast growing young economy is totally different. Of course, since then, the growth has fallen off, and you know where we've gone over the last 7-8 years. We've not reached that level again. But I think ultimately we need to do these reforms and we need to get growth back. If the economy starts growing at 8-9%, automatically people will see opportunities, Indians will see opportunities, and they'll want to work here. So I think it's a matter of opportunity. And government, if it's going to be the my baap or going to control every aspect of the economy, then it's not going to attract people. Then people will prefer. Why do people go to the US? They go to the US because you're free to do what you want, and you're in terms of your enterprise and running business and whatever else, right?
Less rules.
So similarly, the education system is very good, and the universities are very good, and again they give you a lot of free thinking and ideas, and so that is, you have to see why people do it. And if we create the similar ecosystem here, we can attract, and it's absolutely essential. I mean, look at our managers. Our managers are running the biggest companies of the world, whether it's Google or tech companies, or even credit card companies or McKinsey's. Everybody has an Indian manager, so that shows the talent we have, and it's just the ecosystem which is missing. So I think, and for me, firmly, the government in India will never provide you that ecosystem. So yeah, some of us who are interested in policy may want to work for the government like I did, or others do in certain positions. But by and large, most talented people want to do their own business, their own innovation, wealth creation. And for that, I don't think government control is a good thing. Therefore, I always maintain that the government should try and do less and focus on a few things rather than trying to do too many things.
Yes. Since Adam Smith also said, like, focus on law and order and other things.
Yeah, law and order in India's case, as I said, education, health, sanitation, there's a lot of things you can still do to create that ecosystem. But trying to run PSUs or trying to set prices or trying to do too many clearances, all of this makes no sense. I mean, you should be able to start a business and run your business without having to have any inspectors visiting you.
Yes. So that creates the problem for this.
Of course, the part of the problem in India also is that, because we've had this kind of crony capitalism, because of our peculiar partial liberalization, a lot of people don't trust the private sector either. But I think now that should change, because we have a lot of younger generation people who've done all these magnificent startups and got incredible valuations. So none of them have done it because of government connections or government support. So we need to support that ecosystem, and those guys have to become our role models.
That's true. That's indeed. If we talk about sectorally, different sectors in terms of economic philosophy, how do we go forward for growth, employment, and social development right from this position?
When you say sectorally, you mean?
Different sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and services.
Right. So I think the thing with agriculture is that I think if there's one statistic which sums up India's fundamental problem, it's that 40% of India's workforce is in agriculture, producing 13% of India's GDP. Now that shows that, there's a severe problem, and even if agriculture grows very well at 4%, 5%, you're still not going to be able to make those people prosperous. So the only structural solution for India is to get people out of agriculture and into industry. That's the way every country has done it, and I don't see how we can. So far, we've been absorbing a lot of them into services, mostly low-end services or transportation, retail, those kind of things. But I think ultimately, if more of them have to be drawn out, and that's why I always say the solution for Indian agriculture is not in agriculture, it's actually in manufacturing. You have to get people out. So many people cannot productively work in agriculture, no matter what policy you do. Of course, you have to change a lot of policies in agriculture. I'm not saying that agriculture needs no change, but even if you were to change all of that, liberalize marketing, liberalize pricing, do all of that, even then with 40% of the workforce, it's not workable. So I think we definitely need to work much harder on building our manufacturing base. Services is okay. As I said, services, we have a decent base, but again, we can be more competitive in health, education. Look at services beyond IT. We always get stuck at, fine, that's our strength and it has been, and that's a good thing. But let's also invest in certain other services where we can have a comparative advantage. Look at the amount of Indians who study abroad. Some $2-3 billion a year India spends on educating its children abroad. Why can't we do it here? And why can't we in fact get people from other parts of the world to study here?
Yes.
So I think
we are attracting the talent from Africa and other places, like attract some of the from advanced economy.
So I think we need to beef up manufacturing and diversify our services away from IT. And agriculture, we have to let market forces have a greater say in agriculture, but with the realization that so many people cannot survive in agriculture no matter what we do.
Yes. Oh, indeed, like government has recently liberated APMCs, mandis, etc. That's a
very good move. I think that's look at that. You now say a farmer can choose to sell where he wants his produce, but for industry that was allowed 30 years ago. So it's taken that long for it to be applied to farmers.
30 years behind industry, obviously. If we say like bird's eye view, like do you feel that India has lost more than it has gained from being an economy driven by socialistic ideas, a lot of government control, etc.? Does capitalism look like an option that can address our downward spiral?
So yes, I think in fact I always say we were not really even a socialist economy. What it was called in our textbooks, I don't know what you call it these days, was mixed economy.
Mixed economy, state controlled economy.
And I call it a mixed up economy because you had neither state nor market doing what it was supposed to. So in fact some of the communist countries or the genuinely socialist countries, they had a very big focus on infrastructure, education, health, and so on. So although the system failed for various reasons, because non-market bureaucratic controlled economies don't work, but they still invested very well in certain things. We didn't even do that. So our infrastructure, our education, health, which communist countries built or socialist countries built, we didn't focus on that. We focused on PSUs, building up, inefficient industry and so on. So I think we got the worst of both worlds. So we got neither efficient private sector nor efficient government, or forget efficient government, even a government which managed to build, the basic infrastructure for the economy. And I think that overhang continues to plague us even today. So if you look across the political spectrum, there's no political party which really professes a openly center-right economic philosophy. Most of them would be center or center-left and would continue to say greater role for the state. But I think that narrative definitely needs to change, and it hasn't changed. Nobody has actually explicitly made the case that capitalism is better than socialism is. Capitalism, I said, the reason they hesitate is because there's a lot of this cronyism, a lot of businessmen who run away with banks' money, and there's all that aspect as well. So it's difficult sometimes to sell capitalism. But as I said, you need role models. So a new tech entrepreneurs are role model, our old tech entrepreneurs, the Infosys, Wipros of the world, TCS. These are all examples of businesses which have created wealth without cronyism and without connections from the government. And there are a lot of examples. So I think instead of focusing on the one or two bad eggs, every system will have bad eggs. Even in the US, there are scams. Even in China, there are scams. It's not about that. You can never stop a bad egg. But the system needs to focus on the good people, and the system needs to be designed in a way with less government discretion, so that the good people come up more and the cronies stay out. So I think yes, socialism or mixed up economy has not done us any good. In fact, the legacy lingers in our minds, in the minds of the bureaucracy, in the minds of many politicians. So we need to make a clean break from it at some point of time if we really want to. But I think that's the only way to go. At the end, we know capitalism is not a perfect system. Even free markets have to be regulated. We know that. But in India, we are not yet at the stage to debate whether they've been deregulated too much. I think that we're still in the stage where they're too overregulated.
Too overregulated. It means these are the two extremes, and we need to find a midway between. Yes. At last, sir, I'm also a very big fan and quite a frequent reader of your articles. At last, I would like to give certain words of encouragement for Ecoholics.
No, I'd like to congratulate you, and I'm very delighted to talk to you and to learn about this forum, Ecoholics. I never thought people would find economics exciting enough to, or popular. I never thought it was a popular enough subject to sustain such a platform, but I'm absolutely delighted to hear that you're taking economics to a wider audience. I think one of the challenges in economics is that sometimes we don't communicate very well to the people at large. Politicians are communicators, economists like to write papers in journals and talk to each other. But I think we need to widen the conversation, because ultimately all these changes that we've been talking about in the last half an hour, these will not happen unless there's popular support and popular understanding for them. So people need to understand what labor law means, what a change in labor law means. People need to understand demand side, supply side, not in great detail, but people need to be aware generally of the kind of economic policies and economic strategies which are being made by the government, because it affects all our lives. It affects everybody's lives. So I think Ecoholics is doing a great job of taking economics out to more and more people. And I hope you continue to do this wonderful job and get even more people excited about economics and seed the right ideas in the younger generation, so that when they come into positions of influence, they will change the system, in the right.
We are hoping for the best, sir. And thank you so much for coming here and enlightened our students. And it's a pleasure for us to have on board on Ecoholics Thinking Tree. And thank you so much for accepting the invitation. We'll be getting into touch in the near future as well. And we would love to have you again on with different topics, different discussion. So Absolutely. Thank you so much.
I'd be very happy to come and share whatever my experience is with you. And hopefully you'll all be better economists than I am. So all the best.
Thank you so much, sir. It's like for UPSC students, I recommend your articles, especially newspaper articles. I teach for UPSC students, so it's very helpful. And a big thank you from a student's point of view on behalf of the.
I'm very glad you're teaching students, and please, because ultimately UPSC aspirants and students are the future policymakers and the future opinion makers of this country. So I think if you're exposing them to the right kind of ideas and the right kind of experiences, it's a great service.
Thank you so much, sir, for coming to the show.
Thank you.